The autumn sun rose slowly over Whitmore Manor, painting the tall stone towers in soft gold light. Birds sang in the gardens, and the morning mist rolled gently across the wide green lawns. Inside the manor, however, the peace of the morning did not reach every heart. In the east wing, in a room filled with heavy curtains and old paintings of ancestors long gone, Duke Alexander Whitmore sat by the window, staring out at nothing in particular. He was 28 years old, tall, with dark hair and sharp gray eyes that many described as cold, though those who knew him well understood it was only tiredness. Tiredness from years of duty, tiredness from being watched, judged, and expected to be perfect in every way. He was the last remaining heir to the Whitmore family name, and with that title came a weight that pressed on his shoulders every single day. His mother, the Duchess Margaret Whitmore, had been unwell for the past few months. Her once strong voice had grown weaker, though her will remained as firm as iron. That morning, she had summoned him to her chambers before the sun had even fully risen. "Alexander," she had said, her hand resting weakly on the blanket covering her legs, "I do not have many years left, perhaps not many months. There is one thing I ask of you before I close my eyes for the final time. I want to see you married. I want to know that this family, this name, this legacy, will continue after I am gone." Alexander had said nothing at first. He had heard this request many times before, but never with such sadness in his mother's eyes. He loved his mother deeply, and seeing her grow frail broke something inside him that he tried hard to hide. "Mother, you know I have never found anyone who—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "You have never found love in the noble circles. But perhaps love is not something you find by searching too hard. Perhaps it finds you when you finally open the door for it." She had then suggested the idea of a grand ball, not just any ball, but one that would invite every eligible noblewoman and royal beauty from across the kingdom. 100 women, she said, each hoping to catch the attention of the Duke. Surely, among so many, he would find someone worthy of his heart, or at least someone worthy of his family name. Alexander had agreed, not because he believed in the plan, but because he could not bear to deny his mother's dying wish. And so, letters were sent that very day to noble families in every corner of the kingdom, announcing the grand ball to be held at Whitmore Manor in 3 weeks' time. By afternoon, the news had already spread like wildfire through the halls of the manor and beyond its gates. Servants whispered about it while polishing silverware. Cooks discussed it while preparing meals. Even the stable boys talked about it while brushing the horses. The entire manor buzzed with excitement, nervousness, and endless preparation. In the servants' quarters, far from the grand chambers of the nobles, a young woman named Alara worked quietly, unaware of just how much her life was about to change. Alara was 19 years old, with soft brown hair that she always tied back neatly, and eyes the color of warm honey. She was not born into wealth. Her family had once lived in a small village near the edge of the Whitmore estate, farming a modest patch of land. But 2 years ago, a harsh winter had destroyed their crops, leaving her family with debts they could not pay. To help support her parents and younger brother, Alara had come to work at Whitmore Manor as a maid. Her days were long and tiring. She woke before the sun rose to light the fireplaces, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, carried heavy buckets of water up and down countless stairs, and folded endless piles of linen. Yet despite the hard work, Alara never complained. She found small moments of joy in her days, the warmth of the kitchen in the early morning, the sound of birds outside the laundry room window, the kindness of the older servants who treated her like family. That morning, as she carried a basket of fresh linen through the long hallway, she overheard 2 maids gossiping near the kitchen door. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered excitedly. "The Duke is having a ball. 100 noble women are being invited to find him a bride." 100, the other maid gasped. "That is more guests than this manor has ever seen. We will be working day and night to prepare everything." Alara paused for a moment listening. A ball with 100 noble women. It sounded like something out of the old stories her grandmother used to tell her when she was a child. Stories of princes and castles and grand celebrations that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. A world that Alara knew she would never truly be part of. She continued walking, setting the thought aside, as she had learned to do with many things in her life. Dreaming too much about things beyond her reach only brought disappointment, and Alara had long since decided that focusing on her work and her family was a far better use of her time and energy. The days that followed were filled with endless preparation. The manor's grand ballroom, which had been closed for years, was opened and cleaned from top to bottom. Chandeliers that had gathered dust for seasons were polished until they sparkled like stars. New curtains of deep red velvet were hung along the tall windows. Fresh flowers were ordered from every corner of the kingdom to fill the halls with color and fragrance. Elara found herself assigned to help in the gardens during this busy time, since the head gardener needed extra hands to prepare the outdoor areas for the grand event. She did not mind this task at all. In fact, she welcomed it, as it meant she could spend her mornings outside, instead of within the stone walls of the manor. The gardens of Whitmore Manor were truly beautiful, filled with rows of colorful roses, tall trees that provided cool shade, and a small pond where swans glided peacefully across the still water. Elara loved this place more than any other part of the estate. It reminded her of the open fields near her childhood home, though far grander and more carefully arranged. One particular morning, a few days before the ball, Elara was tending to the rose bushes near the eastern wall of the garden. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, a habit she had carried since childhood. Her mother used to say that humming while working made even the hardest tasks feel lighter, and Elara had found this to be true throughout her life. She was so absorbed in her task, carefully trimming the dead leaves from the rose bushes, that she did not notice someone approaching until a voice spoke gently behind her. "That is a lovely tune. What is it called?" Startled, Elara turned quickly, nearly dropping her gardening shears. Standing before her was a man she had never seen before. He wore simple, well-made clothes, nothing like the elaborate outfits she had seen on the noble guests who occasionally visited the manor. His dark hair was slightly messy, as though he had been walking for a while, and his gray eyes held a calmness that seemed almost out of place for someone she assumed was a visiting guest. I am sorry, sir," Elara stammered, quickly standing and brushing the dirt from her apron. "I did not know anyone was here. It is just an old song my mother used to sing." "There is no need to apologize," the man said, a small smile forming on his lips. It was a pleasant surprise. Most people I meet in this manner speak to me with such formality that I forget conversations can be simple and warm. Elara studied him carefully, unsure of what to make of his words. She assumed he must be one of the guests arriving early for the ball, though something about him seemed different from the wealthy visitors she had seen before. He did not carry himself with the same air of arrogance she had witnessed in other nobles. Instead, there was a quiet tiredness in his eyes, similar to the tiredness she often felt after a long day of work, though she suspected his burdens were of a very different kind. "Are you enjoying the garden, sir?" she asked politely, unsure of what else to say to someone she assumed was far above her station. "Very much so," he replied, glancing around at the colorful roses surrounding them. "It is peaceful here, away from all the noise and expectations." Elara nodded, understanding his words more than she expected to. "The gardens are my favorite part of this place too. Everything feels simpler out here." The man's smile grew slightly wider at her response, as though her words had touched something within him. "What is your name, if I may ask?" "Elara, sir." "Elara," he repeated softly, as though testing the sound of it. "I am glad to have met you, Elara. My name is Alex." He did not offer his full name, and Elara did not think to question it. To her, he was simply a guest, perhaps a distant relative of a noble family, or a friend of the Duke visiting ahead of the grand celebration. She had no reason to suspect that the man standing before her, speaking so casually and warmly, was in fact Duke Alexander Whitmore himself, the very man the entire kingdom's noblewomen were preparing to compete for. They spoke for a while longer that morning, their conversation flowing easily despite the difference in their stations. Alexander found himself surprised by how effortless it felt to talk to her. There was no flattery in her words, no attempt to impress him or gain his favor. She spoke honestly, sharing small stories about her family, her village, and her hopes for the future, unaware that she was speaking freely with the very Duke whose ball was about to change the course of her life. For Alexander, it was a rare and refreshing experience. Ever since he could remember, every conversation he had ever had was shaped by his title. People spoke to him carefully, calculating their words, hoping to gain something from his favor. But Elara spoke to him as though he were simply a person, nothing more, nothing less. It was, he realized, the first genuine conversation he had experienced in a very long time. As the morning grew late, Elara reluctantly excused herself, explaining that she needed to return to her duties before the head housekeeper noticed her absence. Alexander nodded understandingly, though a small part of him wished the conversation could have continued longer. "Perhaps we will meet again before the ball," he said as she gathered her tools. "Perhaps," Elara replied with a small smile, though she doubted it would happen. Guests rarely returned to speak with servants once their initial curiosity had passed. She assumed this brief encounter would be nothing more than a pleasant memory to look back on during her long days of work. As she walked back toward the manor, carrying her basket of trimmed roses, Elara found herself smiling, without quite understanding why. There had been something different about that conversation, something that lingered in her thoughts even as she returned to her usual tasks. She told herself it was simply the novelty of speaking with a guest who treated her kindly, nothing more. Yet throughout the rest of her day, as she scrubbed floors and folded linen, her mind kept wandering back to the gentle voice and calm gray eyes of the man she had met in the garden. Meanwhile, Alexander returned to his chambers, his mind equally occupied with thoughts of the young maid he had met. He sat by his window once again, watching the sun begin its descent over the manor grounds, and found himself looking forward to the possibility of seeing her again, more than he looked forward to the grand ball that his mother had arranged with such hope and determination. He knew, of course, that such thoughts were foolish. In 3 weeks, 100 noblewomen would arrive at Whitmore Manor, each hoping to become his bride. His mother expected him to choose someone from among them, someone who would bring honor and strength to the family name. A servant girl, no matter how genuine or kind, was simply not part of that plan. Yet as he closed his eyes that night, it was not the image of any noblewoman that filled his thoughts. It was the sound of a soft, simple tune, hummed by a girl among the roses, and the warmth of a conversation that had felt more honest than any he had known in years. The preparations for the ball continued in the days that followed, growing more elaborate with each passing hour. Tailors arrived to fit the household staff with new uniforms. Musicians were hired to perform throughout the evening. The finest wines and foods were ordered from every corner of the kingdom. The entire manor transformed into a place of grandeur and excitement, counting down the days until the arrival of 100 royal beauties. And though neither Elara nor Alexander could have known it at the time, the quiet morning they had shared among the roses was only the beginning of a story that would soon challenge everything both of them believed about duty, love, and the true meaning of worth. 2 days passed before Elara saw the mysterious guest again, though she found herself thinking of him more often than she wished to admit. Each morning, as she made her way to the gardens with her basket of tools, a small part of her hoped to hear his voice calling out a greeting from somewhere among the rose bushes. She told herself this hope was foolish, that a man of his manner and comfort surely had far more important matters to attend to than speaking with a maid. Yet the hope remained, quiet and persistent, tucked away in the corners of her thoughts. On the third morning, as she knelt beside the flower beds near the eastern wall, she heard familiar footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "I was beginning to think you had grown tired of these gardens," Alexander said, a warm smile spreading across his face as he approached. Elara looked up, and despite her best efforts to remain calm, she could not stop the small smile that formed on her own lips. "I could say the same of you, sir. I did not expect to see you again." "I told you we might meet again before the ball," he reminded her, settling onto the low stone bench nearby. "Though I admit, I have been finding excuses to walk this way more often than necessary." Elara laughed softly at his honesty, a sound that seemed to brighten the entire garden around them. "The gardeners will begin to think you have taken a special interest in our roses." "Perhaps I have," Alexander replied, his gray eyes holding a playful glint. "Though I confess, it is not only the roses that draw me here." Elara felt her cheeks warm slightly at his words, though she chose not to comment on them directly. Instead, she returned to her work, carefully trimming the dried leaves from the nearest bush, while Alexander watched her with quiet interest. "May I ask you something, Elara?" he said, after a moment of comfortable silence. "Of course. Do you enjoy this work? The gardening, the manor duties, all of it?" Elara paused, considering his question carefully before answering. It was not a question most guests bothered to ask servants. Most assumed, without ever asking, that a maid's life was simply one of duty and hardship, nothing more. But Alexander's question felt genuine, as though he truly wished to understand her thoughts. I enjoy parts of it, she said honestly. The gardens, especially. There is something peaceful about working with plants and flowers. Watching something grow, something you have cared for with your own hands, brings a kind of happiness that is hard to explain. But other parts of the work are simply necessary. I do them because my family depends on the wages I bring home, not because I find joy in scrubbing floors or carrying water. That is a very honest answer, Alexander said, genuinely impressed by her candor. Most people I speak with tell me only what they think I wish to hear. I do not know what you wish to hear, sir, Alara replied with a small shrug. So I suppose I can only tell you the truth. Alexander found himself smiling at her words, struck once again by how refreshing her honesty felt compared to the calculated conversations he endured within the walls of noble society. Tell me about your family, if you do not mind sharing. You mentioned them briefly the other day. Alara's expression softened as she thought of her loved ones. My father was a farmer. He worked our small piece of land near the edge of this estate, growing wheat and vegetables to sell at the village market. My mother helped him with the farm, while also caring for my younger brother, Tomas, and me. We were not wealthy, but we were happy. We had enough to eat, a warm home, and each other. What changed? Alexander asked gently, sensing there was more to her story. 2 winters ago, a terrible storm destroyed most of our crops before we could harvest them, Alara continued, her voice growing quieter. Without the harvest, we had no way to pay our debts or buy supplies for the following season. My father tried everything he could to recover, but the damage was too great. We fell deeply into debt, and eventually, we had no choice but to sell most of our land just to survive. I am sorry, Alexander said softly, genuinely moved by her story. There is no need to be sorry, Alara said, offering him a small, brave smile. It is simply what happened. I came to work here at the manor to help support my family, and my wages have allowed us to slowly pay off our debts. My brother is still young, but he helps my father with what little land we have left. We manage. We are grateful for what we have. Alexander studied her closely as she spoke, noticing the quiet strength in her voice, the way she spoke of hardship without bitterness or self-pity. It was a strength he rarely encountered among the nobles he knew, many of whom complained endlessly about troubles far smaller than what Alara had faced. You are remarkably strong, he said quietly. I do not think I have met many people who could speak of such hardship with such grace. Alara shook her head modestly. I do not feel particularly strong, sir. I simply do what needs to be done, as I imagine most people would in my position. Perhaps, Alexander said, though he privately disagreed. He had met many people throughout his life who, given the same hardships, would have crumbled under the weight of them. Alara's quiet resilience was, in his eyes, something truly remarkable. They continued talking for a while longer, their conversation drifting from topic to topic, with an ease that neither of them had expected. Alara asked him about his own life, curious despite herself, though she was careful not to pry too deeply into matters she assumed were private. Alexander answered her questions carefully, revealing pieces of his life without disclosing his true identity. He spoke of the pressures of expectation, of a mother he loved deeply, but who wished for things he was not certain he could give her, and of a loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who wanted things from him, rather than simply wanting to know him. Alara listened carefully to his words, sensing the weight behind them, even though he did not explain their full meaning. It sounds like a difficult way to live, she said softly. Surrounded by people, yet still feeling alone. It is, Alexander admitted, surprised once again by how easily she understood him. You are the first person in a long time who has spoken to me simply as a person, without expecting anything in return. I do not know what I could possibly expect from you, sir, Alara said with a light laugh. I am only a maid. There is little a guest like yourself could offer someone in my position. Alexander wanted, in that moment, to reveal the truth of who he truly was. He wanted to tell her that he was not merely a guest, but the duke of the very manor she worked within, the man for whom 100 noble women were preparing to compete. Yet something held him back. He feared, perhaps, that revealing his true identity would change the way she spoke to him, that the easy warmth between them would vanish, replaced by the same careful formality he received from everyone else. He was not ready to lose the simple honesty of their conversations, not yet. Perhaps pleasant conversation is worth more than you realize, he said instead, choosing his words carefully. Alara smiled at this, though she did not fully understand the depth of meaning behind his words. She glanced up at the sky, noticing the sun had climbed higher than she expected. "I am afraid I must return to my duties, sir. The head housekeeper will wonder where I have gone if I stay much longer." "Of course," Alexander said, standing as she gathered her tools. "Thank you for the conversation, Alara. It has meant more to me than you know." "You are welcome, sir," she replied, offering a small curtsy out of habit, before turning to walk back toward the manor. As she disappeared down the garden path, Alexander remained standing among the roses, his thoughts heavy with a growing realization he was not yet ready to fully accept. In just a few short days, he had found more comfort and connection with a young maid than he had found in years among the nobility. The thought of the approaching ball, filled with 100 women he had never met, suddenly felt heavier and more burdensome than ever before. That evening, as Alara helped prepare the linens for the guest chambers, her mind repeatedly wandered back to her conversation with Alex. She found herself wondering about the life he had described, the loneliness hidden behind polite conversation, the pressure of expectations he seemed to carry so heavily. She did not know his full story, nor his true position, but she sensed a genuine sadness within him that stirred a quiet sympathy in her heart. She scolded herself gently for allowing her thoughts to linger so long on a guest she barely knew. Surely, once the ball arrived and the grand celebrations began, he would return to his own world, filled with noble women and glittering conversations, far removed from her simple life. Whatever connection she felt between them now would likely fade into nothing more than a fond memory, a brief moment of kindness in the midst of her ordinary days. Yet despite her efforts to dismiss these thoughts, she found herself looking forward to their next meeting with a hope she could not fully explain. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. The manor grew busier with each passing hour, as servants scrambled to complete the endless list of tasks required for the grand ball. Alara found fewer opportunities to visit the gardens, as she was called upon to help with numerous other duties throughout the manor. Still, whenever her tasks allowed even a brief moment near the gardens, she found herself glancing around, hoping to catch sight of Alex among the roses. Alexander, for his part, found himself equally distracted from his own responsibilities. His mother noticed his frequent absences from the manor's main halls, questioning him gently about where he spent his mornings. "You seem distracted, my son," Duchess Margaret said one afternoon, as he sat beside her bed, half listening to her discuss the final arrangements for the ball. "Is something troubling you?" "No, mother," Alexander replied, though his thoughts drifted once again to a certain garden and a certain gentle voice. "I am simply thinking about the days ahead. The ball will bring you happiness, Alexander," his mother said softly, reaching for his hand. "I truly believe that among the guests, you will find someone who brings light into your life, just as your father once did for me." Alexander squeezed his mother's hand gently, unable to voice the growing uncertainty in his heart. He wanted to believe her words, wanted to trust that the grand ball would lead him toward genuine happiness. Yet the image of a young maid, humming softly among the roses, lingered stubbornly in his mind, refusing to be replaced by thoughts of the 100 noblewomen soon to arrive at his door. As the days continued to pass, bringing the manor ever closer to the night of the grand ball, both Alara and Alexander found themselves caught between the lives they knew and a connection neither of them had expected nor fully understood. Neither could have predicted how deeply this quiet friendship, born among the roses of Whitmore Manor, would soon challenge everything they believed about duty, love, and the true nature of happiness. The days leading up to the grand ball grew shorter and busier with each passing sunrise. Whitmore Manor buzzed with constant motion, as servants rushed between rooms, carrying flowers, polishing silverware, and preparing guest chambers for the arrival of nearly 100 noble families. Despite the chaos surrounding her, Alara found small pockets of time to slip away to the gardens, if only for a few precious minutes each day. And more often than not, she found Alex waiting for her there, seated on the same stone bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Their meetings had become something Alara looked forward to more than she cared to admit. What began as a chance encounter had slowly grown into a quiet routine, one filled with easy laughter, thoughtful conversation, and a warmth that neither of them had expected to find in each other's company. One afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the leaves above them, Alexander arrived at the garden earlier than usual, carrying something wrapped carefully in a cloth. Alara looked up from the flower bed she had been tending, curious about the bundle in his hands. "What is that, sir?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands as she stood. "A small gift," Alexander said, though there was a hint of nervousness in his voice that Alara found endearing. "I noticed yesterday that your gardening gloves were worn through at the fingertips. I thought you might find use for these." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a new pair of gloves, made of soft leather, far finer than anything Alara had ever owned. She stared at them in surprise, unsure of how to respond. "Sir, I cannot accept such a gift," she said, shaking her head gently. "It is far too generous for someone in my position." "Nonsense," Alexander replied, pressing the gloves gently into her hands, despite her protest. "You spend your days caring for these gardens with such dedication. It seems only fair that your hands should be properly protected while you do so." Alara looked down at the gloves, feeling a warmth in her chest that had little to do with the gift itself, and everything to do with the thoughtfulness behind it. No guest, no visitor, had ever paid such careful attention to her daily struggles before. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "This is very kind of you." "It is the least I could do," Alexander said, watching as she slipped the gloves onto her hands, testing their fit. "You have given me far more than a pair of gloves could ever repay." "And what have I given you exactly?" Alara asked, tilting her head curiously. Alexander considered his answer carefully before speaking. "Honesty, simplicity, a place where I do not have to pretend to be someone I am not. These past days, speaking with you in this garden, have been the most genuine moments I have experienced in a very long time." Alara felt her heart flutter slightly at his words, though she tried to remain composed. "You speak as though your life beyond these garden walls is filled with nothing but pretending." "In many ways, it is," Alexander admitted, his gaze drifting toward the distant manor walls. "The people I usually spend my time with rarely speak their true thoughts. Every conversation is calculated, every smile carefully measured, every word chosen to gain favor or avoid offense. It grows exhausting, after a while, never knowing if the people around you truly mean what they say." "That does sound exhausting," Alara agreed, settling onto the bench beside him. "I suppose I am fortunate, in a way. No one expects much from a maid beyond hard work and a respectful manner. There is little reason for anyone to speak to me with anything other than honesty, since I have nothing anyone could wish to gain by flattering me." "I disagree," Alexander said quietly. "I believe there is a great deal someone could gain from knowing you, Alara. Perhaps not wealth or status, but something far more valuable." Alara glanced at him, curious about the meaning behind his words, though she did not press him further. Instead, she allowed the comfortable silence between them to settle, both of them content simply to sit together, beneath the shade of the old oak tree, watching the gentle movement of leaves overhead. As the days continued to pass, their conversations grew deeper, touching on subjects neither of them had expected to share with someone they had known for such a short time. Alara spoke of her childhood memories, of afternoons spent helping her father in the fields, of her mother's gentle lullabies, and of her hopes that her younger brother might one day have opportunities she herself had never known. Alexander listened intently to every word, finding himself increasingly drawn to the quiet dignity with which she spoke of her simple life. In turn, Alexander shared pieces of his own world, though he remained careful never to reveal his true identity. He spoke of the heavy expectations placed upon him since childhood, of a father he had lost too young, and of a mother whose failing health weighed constantly on his heart. He spoke of feeling trapped between duty and desire, though he never fully explained the exact nature of the choices he faced. "You speak of duty often," Alara observed one afternoon, as they walked slowly along the garden path lined with blooming lavender. "It seems to weigh heavily upon you." "It does," Alexander admitted. "There are certain expectations placed upon men of my circumstances, expectations regarding marriage, family, the future of one's name. Sometimes it feels as though my own wishes matter very little in comparison to what is expected of me." "That sounds like a heavy burden to carry," Alara said sympathetically. "Though I imagine there are advantages to your circumstances that someone in my position could never fully understand." "Perhaps," Alexander said, Yet I have come to realize that advantages of wealth and position do not necessarily bring happiness. Sometimes, I think, true happiness is found in far simpler things. Alara smiled softly at his words, though she remained careful not to read too deeply into their meaning. She reminded herself, as she had many times over the past days, that whatever connection she felt growing between them was likely temporary, a passing friendship destined to fade once the grand ball arrived and Alex returned to whatever world he truly belonged to. Yet despite her efforts to guard her heart, Alara found it increasingly difficult to ignore the warmth she felt whenever she was in his company. There was something about the way he listened to her, truly listened, without judgment or hidden motive, that she had never before experienced with anyone outside her own family. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the garden, Alexander found himself facing a difficult decision. The ball was now only days away, and he knew that once it began, his time for quiet mornings among the roses would come to an end. He would be expected to devote his full attention to the noblewomen gathered in his honor, leaving little room for secret meetings with a maid he had grown to care for so deeply. "Ilara," he said softly, as they sat together watching the sunset, "may I ask you something honestly?" "Of course," she replied, turning to look at him. "If circumstances were different," he began carefully, "if the barriers between us did not exist, would you consider, that is, would it be possible for you to—" He struggled to find the right words, uncertain of how to voice the question weighing on his heart without revealing more than he was ready to share. Alara watched him patiently, sensing his hesitation. "I think," she said gently, saving him from his struggle, "that circumstances rarely change, simply because we wish them to. It is better, perhaps, not to dwell on paths we cannot walk." Her words, though gentle, carried a quiet sadness that mirrored the uncertainty in Alexander's own heart. He nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her caution, even as a part of him wished desperately to defy it. "You are right, of course," he said softly. "Forgive me for the question." "There is nothing to forgive," Alara replied, offering him a small, understanding smile. "I imagine we are both simply enjoying something rare while it lasts." They sat together in comfortable silence as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the hills, each lost in their own private thoughts about the uncertain future awaiting them both. Neither spoke of the ball directly, though its shadow loomed heavily over their quiet moment together, a reminder that their peaceful days among the roses were quickly drawing to a close. As Alara finally rose to return to her duties within the manor, Alexander remained seated on the bench, watching her figure disappear into the growing darkness. He knew, with growing certainty, that whatever he felt for this remarkable young woman had grown into something far deeper than simple friendship. Yet the weight of his responsibilities, the expectations of his mother, and the reality of his true identity all stood as formidable barriers between his heart's desire and the world he was bound to inhabit. That night, alone in his chambers, Alexander stared at the ceiling for hours, wrestling with thoughts he had never before allowed himself to fully consider. In 3 days, 100 noblewomen would arrive at Whitmore Manor, each hoping to win his hand in marriage. Yet the only person who had truly captured his heart in recent memory was a humble maid who had no idea of his true identity, a woman who believed their quiet friendship was nothing more than a passing kindness between two people from vastly different worlds. He knew he could not continue hiding the truth from her forever, yet he feared, more than anything, that revealing his true identity might change everything between them, replacing the genuine warmth of their friendship with the same careful formality he received from everyone else within noble society. As sleep finally claimed him that night, Alexander made a quiet promise to himself. Whatever happened during the grand ball, whatever expectations awaited him, he would find a way to tell Alara the truth before too much time had passed. She deserved that honesty, at the very least, after everything she had given him during these precious, unexpected days among the roses of Whitmore Manor. 2 days before the grand ball, Whitmore Manor transformed into a place unlike anything Alara had ever witnessed. Carriages began arriving from every corner of the kingdom, each one grander than the last, carrying noble families dressed in silks and jewels that sparkled even under the cloudy afternoon sky. The manor's long driveway, usually quiet and empty, now overflowed with the constant clatter of horses' hooves, and the excited chatter of arriving guests. Alara had been pulled away from her garden duties entirely, reassigned by the head housekeeper to help prepare the guest chambers and assist the visiting noblewomen with their needs. It was a task she had not expected, and one that filled her with a strange mixture of curiosity and quiet dread. "You have gentle hands and a calm manner," the head housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, had told her that morning. "The noble ladies will need help with their gowns, their hair, and countless other small matters during their stay. I trust you to serve them well." Alara had nodded obediently, though privately, she wondered how she would manage such unfamiliar duties. She had spent her life caring for gardens and scrubbing floors, not attending to the delicate needs of noblewomen, accustomed to servants catering to their every whim. Her first assignment came that very afternoon, when she was sent to assist a young noblewoman named Lady Cordelia, who had just arrived from a distant province. Alara knocked softly on the guest chamber door before entering, finding the young lady standing before a tall mirror, surrounded by trunks overflowing with elegant gowns. "Finally," Lady Cordelia said, barely glancing at Alara as she entered, "I have been waiting for someone to help unpack these dreadful trunks. Be careful with the blue gown, it is far too delicate for clumsy hands." Alara said nothing, simply nodding and moving to begin the task of carefully unpacking the many gowns, each one more beautiful than anything she had ever seen up close. As she worked, she could not help but overhear Lady Cordelia's conversation with her personal maid, who had traveled with her from home. "They say the Duke is remarkably handsome," Lady Cordelia said, examining her reflection in the mirror with careful scrutiny. "And terribly wealthy, of course. Whichever woman manages to secure his hand will want for nothing for the rest of her life." "I have heard he is quite serious and reserved," her maid replied. "Not easily charmed, from what the other ladies say." "Then I shall simply have to try harder than the others," Lady Cordelia said with a confident smile. "With 100 women competing for his attention, I intend to make certain I am the one he remembers." Alara continued her work quietly, listening to the conversation, without offering any comment of her own. It was strange, she thought, to hear such calculated discussion about winning a man's heart, as though love itself were nothing more than a competition to be won through careful strategy and clever charm. Throughout the rest of the day, Alara found herself moving from chamber to chamber, assisting various noblewomen with their preparations for the days ahead. Each lady seemed more beautiful and more elegantly dressed than the last, their gowns crafted from the finest silks and adorned with jewels that caught the light with every movement. Alara helped brush long, perfectly styled hair, fastened delicate necklaces around graceful necks, and adjusted gowns that fit as though they had been sewn directly onto their wearers. As she worked, she could not help but feel a growing sense of quiet insignificance. Compared to the elegance and refinement surrounding her, Alara felt plain and unremarkable, dressed in her simple gray maid's uniform, her hands rough from years of hard labor. She had never before felt ashamed of her circumstances, having always taken quiet pride in her family's resilience and her own hard work. Yet surrounded by such overwhelming beauty and wealth, she found herself questioning, for the first time, whether she truly belonged in such a grand and glittering world. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did these days, to Alex. She wondered whether he had noticed the sudden arrival of so many noble guests, whether his attention had already begun shifting toward the beautiful women now filling the halls of Whitmore Manor. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest, one she quickly tried to dismiss as foolish sentimentality. Later that evening, as she carried a stack of freshly pressed linens down a long corridor, Alara paused near a large window overlooking the manor's grand entrance. Below, she could see yet another carriage arriving, this one bearing an elegant crest she did not recognize. A young woman stepped out, moving with practiced grace, her golden hair catching the last rays of the setting sun. Even from a distance, Alara could see the woman's striking beauty, the kind of beauty that seemed almost unreal, as though she had stepped directly out of one of her grandmother's old stories. Alara watched for a moment longer before continuing on her way, a quiet heaviness settling over her heart. She understood, with growing clarity, the true scale of what awaited Alex. Not simply one or two noblewomen seeking his favor, but nearly 100 beautiful, accomplished and wealthy women, each one trained since childhood in the arts of charm and elegance, each one far better suited to the world he truly belonged to than a simple maid could ever hope to be. That night, Exhausted from the day's endless tasks, Elara sat alone in the small servants' quarters she shared with two other maids, staring at the new leather gloves Alex had given her just days before. She turned them over gently in her hands, remembering the warmth in his eyes when he had given them to her, the genuine care in his voice as he spoke of wanting to protect her hands. Was it possible, she wondered, that such warmth had simply been a passing kindness, soon to be forgotten once the grand celebrations began? Or had there truly been something deeper growing between them, something that could survive the arrival of 100 royal beauties, each one far more suited to his world than she could ever be? She sighed softly, setting the gloves aside as she prepared for bed. Whatever connection she had felt blooming in the quiet mornings among the roses now seemed impossibly distant, overshadowed by the glittering reality of the world Alex truly belonged to. She resolved, as she closed her eyes that night, to guard her heart more carefully in the days ahead, reminding herself firmly that whatever friendship had formed between them was never meant to last beyond these brief, unusual circumstances. The following morning brought even greater chaos to the manor, as the final wave of noble guests arrived ahead of the ball scheduled for that very evening. Elara found herself busier than ever, moving between chambers to assist with last-minute preparations. She helped fasten intricate hairpieces, adjusted the folds of elaborate gowns, and even helped calm the nerves of a young noblewoman who had grown anxious about making a good impression on the Duke. "Do you think he will notice me?" the young woman, Lady Beatrice, asked nervously, as Elara helped arrange the delicate flowers woven into her hair. "There are so many others, all far more beautiful and accomplished than I am." Elara paused for a moment, surprised by the question. She had not expected any of the noblewomen to seek reassurance from a simple maid, yet something in Lady Beatrice's nervous expression reminded her of her own insecurities from the previous evening. "I think," Elara said gently, choosing her words carefully, "that true kindness and honesty are often more noticeable than we realize, even amid great beauty and elegance. If your heart is genuine, my lady, I believe that is something worth noticing, regardless of how many others surround you." Lady Beatrice smiled softly at her words, seeming genuinely comforted. "That is a kind thing to say. Thank you." Elara nodded, returning to her work, though her own words lingered in her mind long after the conversation had ended. She wondered, with a small flicker of hope, whether her own honesty and genuine friendship with Alex might hold some value, even amid the overwhelming beauty and grandeur of the noblewomen gathered for the ball. As the afternoon wore on, preparations reached their final frantic peak. The grand ballroom, now fully restored to its former glory, sparkled with polished chandeliers and freshly arranged flowers. Musicians began arriving to prepare their instruments, while kitchen staff worked tirelessly to complete the elaborate feast planned for the evening's celebration. Elara, finally given a brief moment of respite from her duties, found herself standing near the edge of the ballroom, watching the final preparations unfold. The room truly was breathtaking, filled with candlelight, fresh flowers, and an atmosphere of excitement that seemed to hum in the very air around her. She wondered, as she watched the preparations, whether Alex would attend the ball himself, curious to see how a simple guest might react to such an extravagant celebration. She had not seen him since their conversation 2 evenings before, and despite her efforts to guard her heart, she found herself hoping for even a brief glimpse of him amid the chaos of the coming celebration. Little did she know, as she stood quietly admiring the transformed ballroom, that the very man she hoped to see was, at that exact moment, standing in his private chambers, staring at his own reflection, with a heavy heart, dreading the arrival of 100 noblewomen he had never wished to meet, while his thoughts remained firmly fixed on the quiet, genuine warmth of a simple maid he had grown to care for far more deeply than he had ever intended. As evening approached and the first strains of music began drifting through the halls of Whitmore Manor, both Elara and Alexander found themselves standing at the edge of a night that would change everything, though neither could have predicted just how dramatically their quiet, secret friendship was about to collide with the glittering world of noble expectation and royal duty. The evening of the grand ball arrived with a golden sunset that slowly faded into a sky scattered with stars. Whitmore Manor glowed brightly, every window lit with warm candlelight, every hall filled with the sound of laughter, music, and excited conversation. Carriages lined the long driveway, and guests dressed in their finest silks and jewels made their way toward the grand entrance, eager for a night that promised to be unlike any other. Inside the ballroom, the transformation was complete. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting soft light across polished marble floors. Fresh flowers filled every corner of the room, their sweet fragrance mixing with the scent of fine perfume worn by the arriving guests. A small orchestra played gentle music from a raised platform near the far wall, setting the tone for an evening of elegance and celebration. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood near the grand staircase, dressed in a formal black coat trimmed with silver, greeting each arriving guest with practiced politeness. His expression remained calm and composed, though inwardly, his thoughts were far from the glittering celebration surrounding him. He shook hands, exchanged pleasant greetings, and offered polite compliments to the endless stream of noblewomen who curtsied before him, each one hoping to catch his attention.
"Your Grace, may I say you look absolutely wonderful this evening," one noblewoman said, her voice dripping with practiced charm.
"Thank you, my lady," Alexander replied automatically, his gaze already drifting toward the next arriving guest. The evening continued in much the same manner, with countless introductions blending together into a blur of silk gowns, sparkling jewels, and rehearsed compliments. Alexander danced dutifully with several of the noblewomen, moving gracefully across the ballroom floor, as expected of him, though his heart remained curiously distant from the festivities surrounding him. Among the many guests that evening was Lady Seraphina Ashford, considered by many to be the most beautiful and accomplished woman in attendance. She wore a stunning gown of deep emerald green, embroidered with delicate silver thread that caught the candlelight with every graceful movement. Her dark hair was styled elegantly, adorned with small jeweled pins, and her confident smile drew the attention of nearly everyone in the room. "Your Grace," Lady Seraphina said, approaching Alexander with practiced elegance as the orchestra began a new song. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" Alexander offered a polite bow, unable to refuse without causing offense. "Of course, my lady." As they moved together across the dance floor, Lady Seraphina spoke with confident charm, discussing her family's extensive estates, her accomplishments in music and art, and her admiration for the grandeur of Whitmore Manor. Alexander listened politely, offering brief responses when necessary, though his attention remained largely distracted. "You seem quite thoughtful this evening, Your Grace," Lady Seraphina observed, her sharp eyes studying him carefully. "Is something troubling you?" "Simply the weight of hosting such a grand event," Alexander replied smoothly, offering an explanation that was not entirely false, though it masked the true source of his distraction. "I imagine it must be difficult," Lady Seraphina said, "choosing among so many guests, all hoping to win your favor, though I suspect Your Grace already has a clear sense of what he is looking for in a future wife." "Perhaps," Alexander said vaguely, eager to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Tell me more about your interest in music, my lady." As the dance continued, Alexander's gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the edges of the grand ballroom, where servants moved quietly among the shadows, refilling glasses and offering trays of delicate refreshments to the guests. He found himself searching, without fully realizing it, for a particular face among the many unfamiliar ones surrounding him. Near the kitchen doors, standing partially hidden behind a large marble pillar, Elara watched the glittering celebration unfold before her. She had been assigned to help carry trays of refreshments throughout the evening, a task that allowed her brief glimpses of the grand ballroom between her many trips to and from the kitchen. She could not help but stare, if only for a moment, at the beautiful scene before her. The noblewomen moved gracefully across the dance floor, their gowns catching the light with every turn, their laughter light and confident. It was, she thought, like something from an entirely different world, one she had only ever imagined, through the stories her grandmother used to tell. Her eyes eventually found Alexander, dancing gracefully with the stunning woman in the emerald gown. Elara felt an unexpected tightness in her chest as she watched them together, though she quickly reminded herself that such a reaction was foolish. Of course he would dance with the noblewomen. That was, after all, the entire purpose of the grand ball. She turned away, focusing instead on her duties, carrying a fresh tray of refreshments toward a group of guests near the far side of the room. As she moved through the crowd, she caught fragments of conversation from various noblewomen, each one discussing the Duke's wealth, his position, and the advantages that would come from securing his hand in marriage. They say his estate is the largest in the kingdom, one woman whispered excitedly to her companion. And his mother is quite ill, another added. Once she passes, he will inherit everything. Whoever becomes his wife will want for nothing. Alara listened quietly as she moved among the guests, feeling increasingly out of place amid such calculated discussions of wealth and advantage. She thought of her own conversations with Alex, the honest, unguarded moments they had shared among the roses, moments that had felt entirely removed from the kind of strategic thinking now surrounding her. She wondered whether he ever grew tired of being valued primarily for his title and fortune, rather than for who he truly was as a person. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself dancing with one noblewoman after another, each conversation blending into the next with exhausting similarity. Compliments were exchanged, family accomplishments were discussed, and each woman made subtle efforts to demonstrate her suitability as a future duchess. Yet despite the beauty and charm surrounding him, Alexander felt an increasing sense of hollow disappointment settling over his heart. None of these conversations, however pleasant, carried the genuine warmth he had come to cherish during his quiet mornings in the garden. None of these women spoke to him as though they were truly interested in his thoughts, his fears, or his hopes for the future. Instead, every word felt carefully measured, every smile calculated for maximum effect. During a brief pause in the dancing, Alexander made his way toward the refreshment table, hoping for a moment's respite from the constant social performance expected of him. As he approached, he caught sight of a familiar figure, moving quietly among the shadows near the kitchen doors, carrying an empty tray back toward the kitchen. His heart quickened slightly at the sight of her, even from a distance. Alara looked different that evening, dressed in a slightly more formal version of her usual maid's uniform, her hair pulled back neatly, though nothing about her appearance could compare to the elaborate gowns and jewels worn by the noblewomen surrounding him. Yet despite the stark contrast, Alexander found his eyes drawn to her, far more powerfully than to any of the glittering guests filling his ballroom. He wanted, more than anything, to excuse himself from the ongoing celebration, if only for a few stolen moments, to speak with her honestly, amid the overwhelming performance of the evening. Yet he knew such an action would draw immediate attention and questions he was not yet prepared to answer. Instead, he forced his attention back to the ballroom, greeting the next noblewoman who approached him with practiced politeness, though his thoughts remained firmly fixed on the quiet servant who had captured his heart so unexpectedly. As the night wore on, the celebration grew louder and more elaborate, with additional courses of food served, followed by more dancing and lively conversation. Alara continued her duties throughout the evening, moving quietly among the glittering guests, feeling increasingly like an invisible observer to a world she would never truly belong to. At one point, while carrying a fresh tray of delicate pastries, she found herself standing near enough to overhear a conversation between Lady Serafina and several of her companions. "The Duke danced with me for nearly 10 minutes, Lady Serafina said confidently, a satisfied smile on her lips. "I believe I have made quite a favorable impression this evening." "You are certainly the most beautiful woman here tonight," one of her companions agreed. "I have no doubt he will remember you above all the others." Alara moved quickly past the group, eager to avoid drawing attention to herself, though the conversation left a quiet ache in her heart. She reminded herself, once again, that whatever friendship she shared with Alex could never compare to the kind of match expected of a duke, a match built on wealth, status, and suitable breeding, rather than genuine connection and honest conversation. As midnight approached, the celebration showed no signs of slowing, with musicians continuing to play lively tunes, and guests dancing energetically across the ballroom floor. Alexander, growing increasingly weary of the constant social performance, found himself glancing repeatedly toward the shadows near the kitchen doors, hoping for even a brief glimpse of the woman who had come to mean so much to him. Finally, during a brief lull in the music, he made a quiet decision. He would find a way, however brief, to slip away from the grand celebration, if only to speak with Alara honestly, away from the prying eyes and calculated conversations of the glittering world surrounding him. Whatever consequences awaited him, he could no longer bear to spend the entire evening pretending that his heart belonged among the noblewomen filling his ballroom, when in truth, it remained firmly and unexpectedly captured by a simple maid among the roses of Whitmore Manor. As the music paused briefly between dances, Alexander seized his chance. He excused himself from a small group of noblewomen with a polite bow, claiming he needed a moment to check on the evening's arrangements. No one questioned him directly, though several curious glances followed him as he made his way toward the edge of the grand ballroom, slipping quietly through a side door that led toward the kitchen corridors. He found Ilara there, setting down an empty tray on a long wooden table, her shoulders slightly slumped from the long hours of work. She looked up in surprise as he approached, quickly straightening and offering a small, formal curtsy out of habit. "Sir," she said softly, glancing nervously toward the kitchen staff, moving busily around them. "You should not be here. This is not a place for guests." "I needed a moment away from the ballroom," Alexander said, his voice low and earnest. "Would you walk with me, Ilara? Just for a few minutes." Ilara hesitated, glancing again at the bustling kitchen around her. "I have duties to attend to." "Please," Alexander said, something in his tone carrying a quiet urgency that caught her attention. "Just a few minutes. I promise, I will not keep you long." Something in his expression, a mixture of hope and vulnerability she had not seen from him before, softened her resolve. She nodded slowly, setting aside her tray and following him quietly through a side door that led out into the manor's moonlit courtyard. The night air was cool and fresh, a welcome relief after the warmth and noise of the crowded ballroom. Moonlight bathed the courtyard in soft silver light, illuminating the small fountain at its center, and the neatly trimmed hedges lining the stone pathways. Distant music drifted faintly from the ballroom, blending gently with the quiet chirping of crickets hidden among the garden shadows. "This is much better," Alexander said, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. "I confess, I have been counting the minutes until I could escape that room, even briefly." Ilara smiled softly, though a hint of confusion remained in her expression. "I would think a man in your position would enjoy such a grand celebration, surrounded by so many admirers." "Admirers who know nothing genuine about me," Alexander replied, his voice tinged with quiet frustration. "Every conversation tonight has felt rehearsed, calculated. Not once have I felt the kind of honesty I have come to know in our conversations these past days." Ilara's cheeks warmed slightly at his words, though she remained cautious, uncertain of what such honesty truly meant, coming from a man she still believed to be a simple guest. "The noblewomen tonight are simply trying to make a good impression, sir. That is only natural, given the circumstances." "Perhaps," Alexander said, stepping closer to her beneath the soft moonlight. "But I find myself far more interested in continuing our conversation than returning to theirs." He extended his hand toward her, a silent invitation that Ilara stared at with wide, uncertain eyes. "Sir, I could not possibly." "Please," Alexander interrupted gently. "One dance, just between us, away from all those watching eyes." Ilara hesitated only a moment longer before placing her hand in his, allowing him to draw her gently into a slow, graceful dance beneath the moonlit sky. Though she had never learned the formal steps taught to noblewomen, Alexander guided her patiently, his hand warm and steady against her own, their movements slow and unhurried beneath the soft glow of moonlight. "You dance beautifully," Alexander said softly, "for someone who claims to know nothing of such things." "You are simply a patient teacher," Ilara replied, a small laugh escaping her lips despite her nervousness. For a few precious moments, the weight of the world beyond the courtyard seemed to disappear entirely. There was no ball, no noblewomen, no expectations pressing down upon either of them, only the quiet comfort of two people moving gently together beneath a star-filled sky. As the dance slowed to its natural end, Alexander found himself unable to release her hand, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear regarding the confession he knew he could no longer delay. "Ilara," he said softly, his voice suddenly serious, "there is something I must tell you. Something I should have told you from the very beginning." Ilara looked up at him, sensing the shift in his tone. "What is it?" Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking the words he had carried silently for days. "My name is not simply Alex. I am Alexander Whitmore, Duke of this estate, the very man this ball has been arranged for." For a long moment, Ilara said nothing, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and disbelief. She slowly withdrew her hand from his, taking a small step backward as the full weight of his words settled upon her. "You are the Duke?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Alexander said, watching her carefully, bracing himself for whatever reaction might follow. I should have told you sooner. I did not mean to deceive you, Alara. I did not want to lose the honesty between us. Once you knew who I truly was, I feared everything would change. Alara took another step back, her mind racing to make sense of everything she had believed over the past several days. Every conversation, every quiet moment among the roses, every kindness he had shown her, all of it now viewed through an entirely different lens. You let me believe you were simply a guest, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You let me speak to you as though we were equals, when all along you were— I know, Alexander said quickly, stepping toward her. I know how it must seem. But please believe me, Alara, everything I said to you, every moment we shared, was genuine. My title changes nothing about the honesty of my feelings toward you. It changes everything, Alara said, shaking her head slowly, tears beginning to blur her vision. You are the Duke of Whitmore Manor. Tonight, 100 noblewomen are inside that ballroom, each one hoping to become your wife. And I am simply a maid who scrubs your floors and tends your gardens. Our worlds could never truly meet, Your Grace. The formal title fell from her lips with a bitterness that struck Alexander deeply, a painful reminder of the very barrier he had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that their friendship might overcome. Please, do not call me that, he said softly. Not you, not after everything we have shared. But it is the truth, Alara insisted, wiping quickly at the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. I forgot myself these past days, allowing myself to believe that our friendship, whatever it was, could mean something real. But nothing has changed, Your Grace. You are still a duke, and I am still a maid. That will never change, no matter how many quiet mornings we share among the roses. Alara, please, Alexander said, reaching for her hand once more, though she pulled away gently, putting further distance between them. I should return to my duties, she said quietly, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and confusion. Before someone notices my absence. Alara, wait. But she had already turned, hurrying back toward the kitchen entrance, leaving Alexander standing alone beneath the moonlit sky, the echoes of distant music drifting faintly from the ballroom behind him. He watched her disappear through the doorway, a heavy ache settling deep within his chest as he realized, with painful clarity, just how deeply his careless silence had wounded the very connection he had hoped so desperately to protect. He remained in the courtyard for several long minutes, gathering his composure, before returning to the glittering celebration awaiting him inside. As he made his way back toward the ballroom, his thoughts remained entirely consumed by the hurt and confusion he had witnessed in Alara's eyes, a look that haunted him far more deeply than any judgment he might have expected from the noblewomen he was supposed to be courting that very evening. Inside the kitchen, Alara wiped hastily at her tears, taking several deep breaths to steady herself before returning to her duties. Her heart felt as though it had been shattered into countless pieces, torn between the genuine affection she had come to feel for the man she had known simply as Alex, and the painful reality of exactly who he truly was. She understood now why he had hesitated to reveal his identity, understood the fear he must have carried of losing the simple honesty between them. Yet knowing his reasons did little to soften the sting of having been unknowingly drawn into a friendship, or perhaps something deeper, with a man whose world was so impossibly distant from her own. As she returned to her duties, carrying fresh trays of refreshments back toward the crowded ballroom, Alara caught brief glimpses of Alexander once again dancing among the glittering noblewomen, his expression composed and dutiful, though she could see, even from a distance, a quiet sadness lingering behind his practiced smile. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on her remaining tasks for the evening, though her heart remained heavy with the painful realization that whatever had grown between them these past days now faced an uncertain and difficult future, one shadowed by the undeniable truth of who Alexander Whitmore truly was, and the vast, seemingly impossible distance that separated a duke from a simple maid. Neither of them could have predicted, as the grand ball continued late into the night, just how much greater that distance was about to become, as jealous eyes among the noble guests had already begun to notice the duke's mysterious absence, and the quiet servant girl, who seemed to occupy far more of his attention than any of the 100 noblewomen gathered in his honor. The morning after the grand ball brought an unusual stillness to Whitmore Manor. Most of the noble guests slept late, exhausted from the previous night's festivities, while the household staff moved quietly through the halls, clearing away the remnants of the celebration. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, a quiet storm had already begun to brew among certain guests, who had witnessed more of the previous evening's events than anyone realized. Lady Seraphina Ashford sat in her guest chamber, sipping tea, while her personal maid, Yvette, brushed out her long dark hair. Though she maintained her usual composed expression, her mind remained sharply focused on something she had witnessed the night before, something that had troubled her far more than she cared to admit. "You seem distracted this morning, my lady," Yvette observed, carefully working through a tangle in her mistress's hair. "I am simply thinking," Seraphina replied, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. "Last night, during the ball, I noticed the Duke disappeared for a considerable amount of time. When he returned, he seemed different, distracted. Many hosts step away briefly during such large events, my lady. Perhaps he simply needed a moment of rest." "Perhaps," Seraphina said, though her tone carried clear doubt. "But I also noticed something else. One of the serving maids returned to her duties around the same time, her eyes red, as though she had been crying. I find the timing rather curious. Do you not agree?" Yvette paused her brushing, meeting her mistress's eyes in the mirror's reflection. "You believe the Duke was with a servant girl, my lady?" "I believe," Seraphina said slowly, a calculating gleam entering her sharp eyes, "that something happened last night, which I do not yet fully understand. But I intend to find out exactly what it was." Meanwhile, in a separate wing of the manor, whispers had already begun circulating among some of the other noble guests. A young noblewoman named Lady Constance, who had happened to glance toward the courtyard windows during the ball, mentioned to her companions that she had briefly glimpsed the Duke standing outside with someone, though she could not clearly identify who it had been in the dim evening light. "It could have been anyone," one of her companions suggested. "Perhaps a household steward discussing arrangements for the evening." "Perhaps," Lady Constance said uncertainly, though it seemed a rather intimate conversation for mere household matters. Such whispers, though vague and uncertain, spread quickly through the manor's guest chambers that morning, growing slightly more elaborate with each retelling, as gossip often does. By midday, several noble guests had heard some version of the story, though none possessed any concrete proof of what had truly transpired the previous evening. Alara, unaware of the growing rumors swirling above her in the noble chambers, moved through her morning duties with a heavy heart. She had barely slept the previous night, her mind replaying the courtyard conversation again and again, torn between anger at having been deceived and a lingering, unwanted affection for the man she now knew to be Duke Alexander Whitmore. She busied herself with her usual tasks, hoping the familiar routine might help settle her troubled thoughts. Yet even as she scrubbed floors and folded linens, she could not shake the memory of his gray eyes, filled with genuine regret, as he had tried to explain his reasons for hiding the truth. "You seem tired this morning," one of the other maids, a kind older woman named Agnes, remarked, as they worked together in the linen room. "Did you not sleep well?" "Not particularly," Alara admitted, though she offered no further explanation. "The ball certainly kept everyone busy," Agnes said sympathetically, misunderstanding the true source of Alara's exhaustion. "I imagine we will all be grateful once the guests finally depart and the manor returns to its usual quiet." Alara nodded absently, though privately, she wondered whether her own heart would ever return to its previous, uncomplicated state, now that she carried the painful knowledge of exactly who Alex truly was, and the impossible distance that separated them. Later that afternoon, as Alara carried a basket of fresh linens down a quiet corridor, she found herself unexpectedly intercepted by Lady Seraphina, who stood waiting near the entrance to the servants' passage, her expression carefully composed. "You there," Seraphina said, her voice carrying an air of practiced authority. "You are one of the maids who assisted with the ball preparations, are you not?" "Yes, my lady," Alara replied cautiously, setting down her basket and offering a respectful curtsy. "I noticed you last night, near the kitchen entrance," Seraphina continued, her sharp eyes studying Alara's reaction carefully. "You seemed rather distressed. Might I ask why?" Alara felt her heart quicken with sudden anxiety, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "I am not certain what you mean, my lady." "It was a long evening, and I was simply tired from the many duties required of the staff. Is that so? Serafina said slowly, clearly unconvinced by the explanation. It is curious, then, that the Duke also seemed rather distracted around that same time, having disappeared briefly from the celebration himself. I would not know anything about the Duke's whereabouts, my lady, Alara replied carefully, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best efforts to remain composed. Serafina studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally offering a thin, calculating smile. Of course, forgive my curiosity. You may return to your duties. Alara hurried away as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart pounding with anxiety over the pointed nature of Serafina's questions. She sensed, with growing unease, that the noblewoman suspected far more than she had openly admitted, and that this brief encounter was unlikely to be the last time such questions were raised. That evening, Alexander found himself once again trapped within the exhausting social expectations of noble courtship, moving through another formal dinner, filled with calculated conversation and careful flattery. Yet his thoughts remained heavily consumed by guilt over how he had handled the previous night's confession to Alara, and growing concern over the subtle whispers he had begun to notice among some of the guests. During a brief pause in the evening's festivities, his mother, Duchess Margaret, called him quietly to her side. You seem troubled, my son, she said softly, studying his face with the keen perception only a mother possesses. Has something happened? Alexander hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to his ailing mother, especially given her fragile health. It is nothing, mother. Simply the exhaustion of hosting such a grand event. Alexander, Margaret said gently, taking his hand in hers. I have known you your entire life. I can see when something weighs upon your heart. Please, tell me what troubles you. Moved by his mother's genuine concern, Alexander finally allowed himself a small measure of honesty, though he remained careful not to reveal too much. I have met someone, mother. Someone who makes me feel genuinely happy, for the first time in longer than I can remember. But our circumstances are complicated, and I fear I may have already caused her unnecessary pain through my own foolish choices. Margaret studied her son carefully, a soft understanding entering her tired eyes. Is this person among our noble guests? Alexander hesitated, uncertain how his mother might react to the full truth. No, mother. She works within our household. A flicker of surprise crossed Margaret's face, though she said nothing critical, simply nodding slowly as she considered her son's words. I see. And do you believe your feelings for her are genuine, Alexander? Not simply a passing fascination? I believe they are the most genuine feelings I have experienced in years, Alexander admitted quietly. Margaret remained silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Love rarely follows the paths we expect it to take, my son. Though I cannot pretend such a situation would be simple, given our family's position, I would never wish for you to sacrifice genuine happiness, merely for the sake of tradition. Speak with your heart, Alexander. Just be certain you also protect the heart of whoever has captured your affection, whatever choices lie ahead. Alexander squeezed his mother's hand gently, grateful for her unexpected understanding, though the weight of the situation remained heavy upon his heart. He knew that beyond his mother's private acceptance, the wider world of noble society, filled with rigid expectations and rampant gossip, would likely prove far less forgiving should the truth of his growing feelings for Alara ever become widely known. Unbeknownst to either of them, Lady Serafina had already begun quietly gathering information, speaking discreetly with several servants and guests throughout the day, piecing together fragments of the previous night's events with growing certainty. By the following morning, she felt confident in her suspicions, though she still lacked the concrete proof necessary to act decisively against the maid who had somehow captured the Duke's attention. Determined not to lose her own chance at securing the Duke's hand, Serafina began formulating a plan, one designed to eliminate her unexpected rival entirely, regardless of the consequences such actions might bring upon an innocent servant girl who had done nothing more than accept genuine kindness from a man she had not even known to be a duke. As the days following the ball continued, tension quietly built beneath the surface of Whitmore Manor's outward calm. Alara remained unaware of the full extent of Serafina's suspicions, continuing her daily duties with a heavy heart, uncertain of what the future might hold for her fragile connection with Alexander. Meanwhile, Alexander struggled with his own growing determination to find a way to properly explain himself to Alara, hoping desperately for an opportunity to repair the trust his careless silence had damaged. Neither of them could have anticipated just how quickly Lady Serafina's jealousy and wounded pride would transform into a dangerous scheme, one that would soon threaten not only Alara's reputation, but her very place within the only home and livelihood she had ever known. 3 days after the grand ball, Whitmore Manor remained filled with noble guests, as many had chosen to extend their stay, hoping for additional opportunities to secure the Duke's favor before returning to their distant estates. Among these guests, Lady Serafina Ashford moved through the manor's halls with quiet purpose, her earlier suspicions having hardened into a firm and dangerous resolve. She had spent the previous 2 days carefully observing Alara's movements throughout the manor, noting her daily routines, her assigned duties, and the particular chamber where she stored her few personal belongings among the other servants. Serafina had also managed to learn, through careful and discreet conversation with other guests, that Alara had indeed been the maid seen near the courtyard on the night of the ball, confirming her earlier suspicions beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, armed with this knowledge, Serafina began putting into motion a plan designed to eliminate the unexpected rival who threatened her carefully calculated pursuit of the Duke's hand in marriage. That evening, while most of the household staff remained occupied with preparing dinner for the many noble guests, Serafina slipped quietly away from the main gathering, making her way toward the servants' quarters with practiced stealth. She carried with her a small, ornate hairpin, adorned with delicate pearls, an heirloom that had belonged to her grandmother, and carried significant sentimental and material value within her family. Finding the small chamber Alara shared with 2 other maids, Serafina slipped inside quickly, her sharp eyes scanning the modest surroundings until she located a small wooden chest near Alara's narrow bed. She opened it carefully, tucking the valuable hairpin beneath a folded shawl, ensuring it would be easily discovered, yet appear as though it had been deliberately hidden. Satisfied with her work, Serafina exited the chamber as quietly as she had entered, returning to the main gathering before her absence could draw any unwanted attention. The following morning, as household staff began their usual duties, a commotion arose from the guest wing. Serafina, appearing genuinely distressed, approached Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, with tears carefully arranged in her eyes. "My grandmother's hairpin is missing," she said, her voice trembling with practiced distress. "It was a treasured family heirloom, passed down through 3 generations. I fear it may have been stolen." Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew immediately serious, understanding the gravity of such an accusation. "Are you certain it has not simply been misplaced, my lady?" "I am certain," Serafina insisted firmly. "I placed it carefully in my jewelry box just yesterday evening. It could not have simply disappeared on its own." Word of the missing heirloom spread quickly through the manor, causing considerable alarm among the household staff, who understood the serious consequences such an accusation could bring. Duke Alexander, informed of the situation shortly after breakfast, ordered a thorough search of the guest chambers and staff quarters, hoping to resolve the matter quickly and quietly. Alara, unaware of the scheme unfolding around her, continued her morning duties, with no sense of the danger approaching. She was in the midst of preparing breakfast trays for departing guests when Mrs. Whitfield approached her, her expression grave and unusually serious. "Alara, I need you to come with me immediately," the housekeeper said, her tone leaving no room for questions. Confused but obedient, Alara followed Mrs. Whitfield toward the servants' quarters, where she found several other staff members gathered outside her chamber, along with Lady Serafina, and, to her growing horror, Duke Alexander himself. "What is happening?" Alara asked, her voice filled with genuine confusion as she looked between the serious faces surrounding her. "A valuable item belonging to Lady Serafina has gone missing," Mrs. Whitfield explained carefully. "We must search all staff quarters to resolve this matter." Alara's heart began pounding with anxious dread, though she remained confident in her own innocence. "Of course, please, search wherever you need to." The search began immediately, with Mrs. Whitfield carefully examining the small chamber Alara shared with 2 other maids. Alara watched nervously, though she felt certain nothing incriminating could possibly be found among her few humble belongings. Yet when Mrs. Whitfield opened Alara's small wooden chest, her expression shifted immediately to one of shocked disbelief. She carefully lifted the folded shawl, revealing the delicate pearl hairpin hidden beneath it. "Is this the missing item, my lady?" Mrs. Whitfield asked quietly, though the answer was already evident from Serafina's triumphant expression.
Yes.
Serafina confirmed, her voice carrying carefully measured shock. That is my grandmother's hairpin. The room fell into stunned silence, as every eye turned toward Alara, whose face had gone completely pale, with shock and confusion. I did not take that, Alara said, her voice trembling with desperate sincerity. I have never even seen that hairpin before this moment. I swear it. The evidence suggests otherwise, Serafina said coldly, though a faint, satisfied gleam flickered briefly in her eyes, quickly hidden behind an expression of practiced sadness. Alexander, who had remained silent throughout the search, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. Alara, is there any explanation for how this item came to be among your belongings? I do not know, Alara said, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. I promise you, Your Grace, I have never taken anything that did not belong to me. Someone must have placed it there. A convenient explanation, Serafina interjected sharply, though I fail to see who else would have reason to place my family's heirloom among a servant's belongings. The accusation hung heavily in the air, and though Alexander desperately wanted to believe Alara's protests of innocence, the physical evidence before him made her defense seem, to the other witnesses present, increasingly difficult to accept. I must ask you to remain here while we determine the appropriate course of action, Mrs. Whitfield said gently, though her tone carried an unmistakable note of regret. Word of the incident spread rapidly through the manor, growing more exaggerated with each retelling among the staff and guests. By afternoon, most of the household had heard some version of the story, many accepting without question that the quiet, humble maid had somehow been driven to theft, perhaps out of desperation from her family's earlier financial hardships. Alara, overwhelmed by shame and confusion despite her innocence, found herself increasingly isolated from her fellow servants, many of whom, though sympathetic, feared associating too closely with someone accused of such a serious offense. Even Agnes, who had always treated her with kindness, seemed hesitant and uncertain how to approach her following the accusation. Alexander, torn between his growing feelings for Alara and the weight of evidence presented against her, found himself facing intense pressure from Lady Serafina and several other noble guests, who insisted that proper justice required Alara's immediate dismissal from the household. Your Grace, Serafina said firmly, during a private conversation later that day, I understand your hesitation, but surely you recognize the necessity of addressing this matter appropriately. If word spreads that theft within your household goes unpunished, it will reflect poorly upon your family's reputation. Alexander struggled internally, torn between his instinctive belief in Alara's innocence and the undeniable weight of the evidence discovered among her belongings. I need time to consider the matter carefully, he said finally, though the pressure surrounding him continued to build with each passing hour. That evening, Alara was called once more, before Mrs. Whitfield and several senior household staff, informed that, given the serious nature of the accusation and the evidence discovered, she would need to be dismissed from her position at Whitmore Manor, effective immediately. I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy despite the formal nature of her duty. But given the circumstances, I have little choice but to follow proper procedure. Please, Alara said desperately. I have worked here faithfully for 2 years. I have never once taken anything that was not mine. You must believe me. I want to believe you, Alara, Mrs. Whitfield said softly. But the evidence discovered leaves little room for doubt, at least in the eyes of those making this decision. Alara felt her heart break as the reality of her situation settled fully upon her. Not only would she lose her position and the income her family desperately depended upon, but her reputation, the one thing she had always taken quiet pride in maintaining despite her humble circumstances, now lay in ruins, destroyed by an accusation she could not disprove. She thought briefly of seeking out Alexander directly, of pleading her case before the man who had once spoken so warmly of honesty and genuine connection between them. Yet pride, mixed with a painful sense of betrayal at how quickly circumstances had turned against her, held her back. She could not bear the thought of begging for mercy from a man whose world had already proven itself so vastly different from her own. A world where a noblewoman's word apparently carried infinitely more weight than that of a humble maid, regardless of the truth. That night, Alara packed her few belongings quietly, her hands trembling as she folded her spare uniform, and gathered the small collection of personal items she had accumulated during her 2 years of service. She paused briefly, her fingers brushing against the soft leather gloves Alexander had given her weeks before, the very gift that had once filled her with such warmth and hope. She considered leaving them behind, a final symbolic rejection of the connection that had ultimately brought her nothing but heartache and public shame. Yet something within her, perhaps a lingering fondness she could not fully extinguish despite everything that had happened, caused her to tuck the gloves carefully into her small travel bag instead. Early the following morning, before most of the household had risen, Ilara slipped quietly out through the servants' entrance, her small bag of belongings clutched tightly in her hands. She did not look back at the grand manor that had been her home for the past 2 years, unable to bear one final glimpse of the place where she had briefly, foolishly perhaps, believed happiness might be possible, despite the vast differences separating her from the man she had come to care for so deeply. As she made her way down the long, familiar road leading toward her family's modest home, tears streamed silently down her cheeks, each step carrying her further from Whitmore Manor and the shattered dreams she now left behind. She had no way of knowing that, even as she walked away in heartbroken silence, the truth behind Lady Seraphina's cruel scheme had already begun to unravel, thanks to the quiet observations of a loyal servant who had witnessed far more than anyone realized on the night the precious hairpin had truly gone missing. News of Ilara's dismissal reached Alexander only after she had already departed the manor, having spent the previous evening deliberately avoiding the difficult conversation, uncertain of what he could possibly say to ease her pain, given the weight of evidence against her. When Mrs. Whitfield informed him that Ilara had left quietly before dawn, a heavy, sickening regret settled deep within his chest. "She left no message?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "None, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield replied gently. "I believe she felt there was little point in saying more, given the circumstances." Alexander retreated to his study that morning, unable to focus on any of the usual duties awaiting him. He kept replaying the scene from the previous day, the shock and desperate sincerity in Ilara's eyes as she denied the accusation, a sincerity that had felt, even in that tense moment, far more convincing than the physical evidence discovered among her belongings. Something about the entire situation troubled him deeply. Ilara had never given him reason to doubt her honesty, not once, during their many conversations among the roses. Her humility, her quiet dignity, even her willingness to gently correct him when he spoke carelessly, all of it painted a picture of a woman incapable of the deceit she had been accused of. Yet he had allowed the pressure of the moment, the weight of Lady Seraphina's insistence, and the visible proof of the hairpin, to cloud his judgment when it mattered most. He resolved, sitting alone in his study, that he would not simply accept the matter as settled. Something did not fit, and he intended to discover the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that pursuit might prove for his noble guests. Alexander summoned his most trusted steward, a quiet, observant man named Thomas Hale, who had served the Whitmore family faithfully for over 15 years. Thomas had a reputation among the staff for noticing details others often missed, a trait Alexander now hoped might prove useful. "Thomas," Alexander said, once they were alone in his study, "I need your help with a delicate matter. I do not believe Ilara is guilty of the theft she has been accused of. I want you to quietly look into what truly happened on the night the hairpin disappeared." Thomas considered the request carefully before nodding. "I confess, Your Grace, I have harbored some doubts myself. I happened to notice something rather curious that evening, though I did not think much of it at the time." Alexander leaned forward with sudden interest. "What did you see?" "I saw Lady Seraphina's personal maid, Yvette, leaving the servants' quarters that evening, at an hour when she had no obvious reason to be there," Thomas explained. "I assumed at the time she was simply delivering a message or seeking assistance with some minor matter. I did not think to question her presence further." "Do you believe she may have been involved somehow?" Alexander asked. "It is possible, Your Grace, though I cannot say for certain without further investigation." "Then investigate," Alexander said firmly. "Discreetly, but thoroughly. I want the full truth of this matter, whatever it may be." Over the following 2 days, Thomas quietly gathered information, speaking carefully with various members of the household staff, piecing together a timeline of events from the evening the hairpin had supposedly gone missing. He learned that Yvette had indeed been seen near the servants' quarters shortly before the alleged theft was discovered, a detail that several staff members had noticed but dismissed as unimportant at the time. Thomas also discreetly examined Lady Seraphina's own chamber, with the quiet permission of Mrs. Whitfield, searching for any additional clues that might support or disprove his growing suspicions. During this search, he discovered a small, empty velvet box tucked within Seraphina's jewelry collection, a box whose size and shape matched precisely the description of where the missing hairpin would have originally been stored. Armed with this information, Thomas approached Yvette directly, employing careful questioning designed to encourage honesty without appearing overtly accusatory. "I understand you were near the servants' quarters the evening Lady Seraphina's hairpin disappeared," Thomas said calmly, watching Yvette's reaction closely. "I simply wish to understand the full sequence of events, to ensure justice has been properly served." Yvette's composure faltered slightly at the direct question, her eyes flickering nervously toward the door, as though considering an escape from the conversation.
I do not recall anything unusual, sir."
"That is curious," Thomas continued gently, "given that several staff members clearly recall seeing you there, at an hour when you had no apparent reason to be present." Yvette's hands began trembling slightly, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the quiet pressure of Thomas's steady questioning. "I cannot say, sir. Please, do not ask me further." "Yvette," Thomas said, his voice firm, but not unkind, "an innocent woman has lost her position and her reputation because of what happened that evening. If you know something relevant to this matter, I strongly urge you to speak honestly now, before this situation grows any more serious." The young maid's resolve finally broke under the weight of her guilty conscience. Tears filled her eyes as she began to speak, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and genuine remorse. "Lady Seraphina instructed me to keep watch while she placed the hairpin among the maid's belongings," Yvette confessed quietly. "She told me it was simply meant to teach the girl a lesson, that no harm would truly come of it. I did not realize how serious the consequences would become until it was already too late." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and quiet anger at hearing the confession. Relief that the truth had finally emerged, and anger at the cruelty of the scheme that had cost an innocent woman her home and reputation. "Thank you for your honesty, Yvette," Thomas said gently. "This information must be shared with the Duke immediately. I strongly encourage you to accompany me and repeat exactly what you have just told me." Yvette, though frightened of the consequences her confession might bring upon herself, agreed, recognizing the wrong that had been done and the moral necessity of setting the situation right. Alexander listened with a mixture of growing anger and painful relief as Thomas brought Yvette before him, allowing her to repeat her confession in full detail. The truth, once revealed, painted a clear and damning picture of Lady Seraphina's calculated cruelty, motivated entirely by jealousy and a ruthless determination to eliminate any perceived rival for the Duke's affection. "I want Lady Seraphina brought before me immediately," Alexander said, his voice carrying a cold authority that left no room for argument. When Seraphina arrived, summoned unexpectedly to the Duke's private study, she maintained her composed and confident demeanor, unaware that her carefully constructed scheme had already fully unraveled. "You wish to see me, Your Grace," she said, offering a graceful curtsy. "I know the truth, Lady Seraphina," Alexander said, his voice carrying barely restrained fury beneath its calm surface. "I know that you deliberately placed your grandmother's hairpin among Ilara's belongings, and that you falsely accused an innocent woman of theft, purely out of jealousy, and a desire to eliminate her from any possible connection to me." Seraphina's confident expression faltered immediately, her carefully maintained composure crumbling as she realized her scheme had been fully exposed. "Your Grace, Do not bother denying it," Alexander interrupted sharply. "Your own maid has confessed the entire scheme in full detail. Your actions have cost an innocent woman her home, her livelihood, and her reputation, all because your pride could not accept that my affections might belong to someone other than yourself." "Your Grace, please understand," Seraphina said, her voice now trembling with genuine fear rather than practiced distress. "I simply could not bear the thought of losing such an opportunity to a common servant. Surely you understand the position such a match would place upon your family's reputation." "What I understand," Alexander said coldly, "is that you were willing to destroy an innocent life simply to protect your own ambitions." Such cruelty has no place within my household, nor within any household I would ever associate myself with." He turned to Mrs. Whitfield, who had been summoned to witness the confrontation. "See that Lady Seraphina's belongings are packed immediately. She is to leave Whitmore Manor before nightfall, and I will personally ensure that the full truth of this matter becomes known among the noble families of this kingdom, so that her reputation suffers the same public consequences she so callously inflicted upon an innocent woman." Seraphina, recognizing the futility of further protest, lowered her eyes in shameful silence, allowing herself to be escorted from the study, without further argument. Her carefully calculated pursuit of the Duke's hand had ended not in triumph, but in public disgrace, a fitting consequence for the cruelty she had inflicted upon someone who had never posed any true threat, beyond the simple, genuine affection she had unknowingly earned from the Duke's heart. Once Seraphina had been dealt with, Alexander turned his full attention toward correcting the grave injustice done to Alara. He immediately summoned the household staff, publicly clearing her name before everyone who had witnessed her humiliating dismissal just days before. Alara was falsely accused through a cruel and deliberate scheme, Alexander announced firmly. She is entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, and I deeply regret the pain and injustice this household allowed her to suffer. Her position here remains open, should she choose to return, and her reputation shall be fully restored, both within these walls and throughout the wider community. Though relieved that the truth had finally emerged, Alexander felt little comfort in the victory, knowing that Alara had already departed the manor in heartbroken shame, unaware that her name had since been cleared. He understood, with painful clarity, that clearing her reputation among the household staff meant little if she remained unaware of the truth, still believing herself unjustly labeled as a thief in the eyes of the only home she had known for the past 2 years. Determined to make things right, Alexander resolved that very afternoon to travel personally to the small village where Alara's family resided, unwilling to leave such an important matter to messengers or formal letters. He needed to see her himself, to offer not only a formal apology, but the full truth of his feelings, unclouded by hesitation or fear of consequence. As he prepared for the journey, his heart carried both hope and uncertainty. Uncertain whether Alara would ever be willing to forgive the pain his silence and hesitation had ultimately allowed her to suffer, yet determined nonetheless to make whatever amends necessary to prove the sincerity of feelings that had only grown stronger throughout the painful days of her absence from Whitmore Manor. The road leading to Alara's village wound through gentle hills and quiet farmland, far removed from the grandeur of Whitmore Manor. Alexander rode in silence for most of the journey, his thoughts consumed by the words he hoped to speak once he finally reached her. He had rehearsed his apology countless times in his mind, yet none of the versions felt adequate to express the depth of his regret, nor the sincerity of feelings that had only grown stronger during the painful days of her absence. By the time he arrived at the small village, the afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the modest homes and narrow dirt paths. He dismounted near the village square, drawing curious glances from several villagers who had never before seen a nobleman's horse or fine traveling coat within their humble community. "Excuse me," Alexander said, approaching an elderly woman selling vegetables from a small cart. "I am looking for the home of a young woman named Alara. I understand her family resides somewhere in this village." The woman studied him carefully, clearly puzzled by the sight of such a finely dressed stranger, inquiring after a local farming family. "Alara Bennett, you mean? Her family's cottage is just down that path, past the old mill. Though I must ask, sir, what business does a gentleman like yourself have with the Bennett family?" "A matter of great importance," Alexander replied simply, offering a polite nod of thanks before continuing down the path she had indicated. As he walked, his heart pounded with a nervous anticipation he had rarely experienced, even during the most demanding moments of his noble duties. He passed small gardens filled with vegetables, modest homes with thatched roofs, and children playing happily in the afternoon sunlight, a simple, peaceful world, entirely different from the grandeur of Whitmore Manor, yet one that carried its own quiet beauty. Finally, he arrived at a small stone cottage nestled at the edge of the village, smoke rising gently from its chimney. Through an open window, he could hear the faint sound of voices, one of which he immediately recognized as Alara's, though her tone carried a heaviness he had never heard from her before. He approached the wooden door and knocked gently, his heart racing as he waited for a response. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with tired eyes and work-worn hands, clearly Alara's father. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked, his expression cautious as he took in Alexander's fine clothing. "My name is Alexander Whitmore," he said, choosing honesty immediately, rather than risk further deception. "I am the Duke of Whitmore Manor. I have come to speak with your daughter, Alara, if she is willing to see me." The man's eyes widened with surprise, though his expression quickly shifted toward wary concern. "The Duke himself, come all this way? Forgive me, your grace, but my daughter returned home just days ago in considerable distress. If you have come to cause her further pain, I must respectfully ask you to leave." "I have come to correct a terrible wrong, sir," Alexander said earnestly. "Your daughter was falsely accused of a crime she did not commit. I have since discovered the truth, and I have come personally to apologize, and to make certain she understands that her name has been fully cleared." Alara's father studied him carefully for a long moment, before finally stepping aside. "Very well, your grace. Please, come in." Alexander entered the small, humble cottage, immediately struck by its warmth despite its modest size. A cooking fire crackled gently in the corner, filling the air with the comforting scent of simmering vegetable stew. Simple wooden furniture, clearly crafted by hand, filled the small space, while a young boy, presumably Alara's brother, sat quietly near the fireplace, watching the unexpected visitor with wide, curious eyes. Alara herself stood near the small kitchen table, her expression frozen in stunned disbelief, as she recognized the man now standing within her family's humble home. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you, Alara," Alexander said gently, stepping further into the room. "I needed to tell you the truth in person, not through messengers or letters." Alara's mother, who had been standing near the fireplace, quietly gathered her younger son and stepped discreetly toward the cottage's second room, sensing the need for privacy, while Alara's father remained nearby, though he too moved toward the doorway, offering the two of them space to speak. "The truth?" Alara repeated, folding her arms protectively across her chest, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of hurt and cautious curiosity. "Lady Serafina placed the hairpin among your belongings herself," Alexander explained carefully. "She orchestrated the entire scheme out of jealousy, hoping to eliminate you as any possible rival for my affection. Her own maid confessed the full truth, and Serafina has since been sent away from Whitmore Manor, in complete disgrace." Ilara's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: shock, relief, and finally a deep, painful anger that had clearly been building since the moment of her humiliating dismissal. "Do you understand what these past days have cost me?" she said, her voice rising with an intensity Alexander had never before witnessed from her. "My reputation, my position, everything I worked so hard to build for my family, all destroyed because of a scheme I had no way of defending myself against. And where were you, your grace, while all of this was happening? Did you defend me then, when it truly mattered?" Alexander lowered his eyes, accepting the weight of her justified anger. "No. I allowed doubt and pressure from others to cloud my judgment in that critical moment, and for that, I am deeply ashamed. I should have trusted you immediately, without hesitation. I should have fought for you the very moment the accusation was made, rather than allowing you to leave believing yourself guilty in the eyes of everyone who mattered." "Then why come now?" Alara asked, tears beginning to blur her vision despite her efforts to remain composed. "Why come all this way, simply to tell me the truth after the damage has already been done?" "Because I love you, Alara," Alexander said softly, the words finally escaping after days of careful consideration. "I have loved you since those quiet mornings among the roses, long before I understood the true depth of what I was feeling. I was a fool to hide my identity from you, and an even greater fool to hesitate when your innocence needed defending. But I refused to remain silent any longer about the truth of my heart, regardless of the consequences such honesty might bring." Alara stared at him, stunned into silence by the sincerity evident in both his words and his expression. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the small cottage filled only with the gentle crackling of the fire and the distant sound of birds singing outside. "You are a duke," she finally said quietly, though her voice had lost much of its earlier anger, replaced instead by a weary uncertainty. and I am simply a maid, one who has now been publicly accused of theft, regardless of whether the truth has since come to light. Even if my name is cleared, do you truly believe our worlds could ever come together as one? I do not simply believe it, Alexander said firmly, stepping closer. I am determined to make it so, Elara, if you will allow me the chance. I do not care what noble society expects of me. I have spent my entire life fulfilling expectations that brought me no true happiness, surrounded by people who valued my title far more than they ever valued me as a person. You are the only person who has ever spoken to me with complete honesty, without calculation or hidden motive. That kind of genuine connection is worth far more to me than any title or fortune could ever provide. Elara felt her resolve softening, despite her lingering hurt, moved deeply by the raw sincerity in his words. And what of your mother? Of noble society? Surely they would never accept such a match. My mother already knows of my feelings for you, Alexander said gently. She has given her blessing, understanding that true happiness matters far more than rigid tradition. As for noble society, their opinions matter little to me, compared to the genuine happiness I have found in your company. I am prepared to face whatever judgment they might offer, so long as I have the chance to build a life with you by my side. Tears now fell freely down Elara's cheeks, though her expression had shifted from anger toward something closer to cautious hope. This is not something I ever imagined possible, Your Grace. Please, Alexander said softly, reaching gently for her hand. Call me Alex. Just as you did during those precious mornings among the roses, before any of this complicated truth came between us. Elara allowed him to take her hand, though her expression remained thoughtful, still processing the overwhelming events of the past several minutes. Alex, she said quietly, testing the familiar name once more, finding comfort in its simplicity, despite everything that had changed between them. I know I have caused you tremendous pain, Alexander continued, and I do not expect forgiveness, simply because I have traveled here to apologize. But I hope, in time, you might find it within your heart to give our connection another chance, to allow me the opportunity to prove that my feelings for you are genuine, and that I am willing to fight for our happiness, regardless of whatever obstacles noble society might place before us. Elara studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of insincerity, yet finding only genuine hope and quiet vulnerability in his gray eyes, the very qualities that had first drawn her to him during those simple, honest mornings in the garden. I need time, she said finally, though her voice carried a gentleness that had not been present when the conversation began. Time to process everything that has happened, to trust that this connection between us is truly worth the challenges it will certainly bring. Take whatever time you need, Alexander said sincerely. I will not pressure you further. I simply wanted you to know the truth, both of Lady Seraphina's scheme and of my own genuine feelings, before I returned to Whitmore Manor. He gently released her hand, offering a respectful bow before turning to leave. Yet as he reached the cottage door, Elara's voice called out softly behind him. Alex, she said, causing him to pause and turn back toward her. Thank you, for coming here yourself, and for telling me the truth, however difficult it may have been. You deserve nothing less, Alexander replied simply, offering a small, hopeful smile, before finally departing the humble cottage. Over the following weeks, Alexander returned to the village several times, careful never to pressure Elara, yet determined to demonstrate the sincerity of his feelings, through patient, consistent kindness. He spoke with her family, earning their trust through genuine humility and respect, entirely different from the arrogant nobility they had expected from a man of his position. Slowly, gradually, the trust between Alexander and Elara began to rebuild, strengthened now by an honesty neither of them had to hide behind false identities or unspoken fears. Word of the Duke's genuine affection for the humble maid eventually spread throughout the kingdom, met with varying reactions from noble society. Some viewed the match with quiet disdain, unable to accept such a significant departure from tradition. Yet many others, moved by the genuine love story unfolding before them, found themselves quietly rooting for the unlikely couple, recognizing something rare and admirable in a duke willing to defy expectation for the sake of true happiness. Several months later, Whitmore Manor once again filled with guests, though, This celebration carried a very different purpose than the grand ball that had first brought Alexander and Alara together. This time, the noble families gathered not to compete for the Duke's hand, but to witness his wedding, as Alexander Whitmore formally married Alara Bennett before the very court that had once doubted her worth. Alara stood at the altar in a gown far simpler than those worn by the noblewomen who had once competed for Alexander's affection, yet she radiated a quiet confidence and genuine joy that outshone every jewel and elaborate design worn during the original ball. Duchess Margaret, though frail, sat proudly among the guests, her heart full of quiet happiness at witnessing her son's genuine happiness at last. As Alexander took Alara's hand before the assembled guests, he spoke words that would be remembered throughout the kingdom for years to come. I once believed that duty and happiness could never truly coexist, that love was simply a luxury reserved for those born into fortunate circumstances. But Alara has taught me that true worth is never measured by titles or wealth, but by honesty, kindness, and the courage to remain true to oneself, regardless of circumstance. I am endlessly grateful that fate brought us together among the roses, and I promise to cherish and honor that genuine connection for the rest of our lives together. The kingdom watched, many with genuine admiration, as the humble maid who had once been unjustly accused and cast aside became the Duchess of Whitmore Manor, her quiet strength and unwavering honesty finally receiving the recognition and happiness she had always deserved. Their story, whispered among servants and nobles alike for years to come, served as a powerful reminder that true love, built upon genuine honesty and mutual respect, could triumph over even the most rigid boundaries of birth and circumstance, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not among glittering jewels and noble titles, but in the simple, sincere warmth of a single genuine heart.